OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about some of these short pieces that we've done. This is the second video like this, and a lot of our work really focuses on epistemology, mental models, how to think about thinking, because it seems today that we have more information than ever before, more things we need to think about, and it's not so self-evident. It's never self-evident what model that we need to use for these different kinds of information. And if we don't figure it out, it seems to be causing a lot of problems. So, we focus a lot on that. And you can find any of these pieces on ogrose.com. But the first one we have here is called Everyone is Rational. And basically, this is just suggesting that nobody does anything they think is irrational. If they touch fire, which is arguably stupid, they must be doing it because they want to impress someone, feel pain, or see what fire feels like. In light of that desire and want, touching the fire becomes rational to them, even if it's not actually rational. It's kind of similar to that Augustine idea that there's no such thing as an evil motivation, because if you're doing something, you must think it's good for you. Now, if it's actually good is a different question. But the reason I think it's important to realize that everyone is quote-unquote rational is because often we can think the problems of the world would be solved if people were just more rational. If we were to increase the amount of rationality that people had, then things would get better. But you see, rationality is relative to what people believe is true, and if truth comes before rationality, it will not necessarily be the case that increasing rationality will change the truth to which people ascribe. And this brings up a question of how then do people ascribe to truths, and that's a topic of a lot of works by O.G. Rose. The next small piece we have is called meta-talks, and basically a meta-talk is when we talk about the mechanisms of talking, thinking, relationships, and the like. It's not simply about relationships or the day or the groceries or food. It's about the entire framework by which we make decisions of those things. And there's an O.G. Rose conversation between me and Michelle talking about how it's important to have meta-talks for relationships and just to function in life in general. So, we could say that meta-talks are examining the glasses through which we see the world, while talking is to see through the glasses. So we have to be intentional about our frameworks. The next piece here is called I Think, Therefore There Is Reason to Think, and that's just going to be a little piece on Descartes, which is going to suggest that it's not so much that Descartes proves that we exist, I think, therefore I am. It's almost more so, I think we can say that he proves that we are a closed system that must assume our existence in order to proceed. It's almost like he says we have to take Descartes as meaning we can't not exist, sort of a double negative there. And this is important because then we can think of Descartes as a systems thinker and help us realize that we have to think within systems, and I think this is important. Next piece is called Unjustification and Consequences to Others, and this is just going to argue that when we come to this, there's this interesting question and debate of how much evidence is needed to justify a premise, and there's actually not an objective standard necessarily, and it's also kind of mysterious when we decide to be convinced by something, and this is going to be discussed in Compelling and The Conflict of Mind, both longer papers. And this little short piece is going to argue that perhaps the justification for a case should be relative to how much it's going to affect other people versus ourselves. For example, the evidence I need to walk to the mailbox if I just want to walk alone is less than maybe if I want other people to join me. So this is also going to suggest that as you get bigger and bigger systems that can have more and more influence and consequence, that the amount of evidence needed to justify any initiative that those big systems want to put forth should probably go up. The next piece here is going to be called Rationality is Mostly About Making Good Bets, and that might even sound kind of vulgar, but the point is that we're getting at is that life is very rarely just problems and solutions, especially when you get into complex stuff. Often life is not mere syllogisms, and the outcomes are not clear. Basically, most of the time we're dealing with probabilities, and it's actually very problematic that we kind of learn about rationality in epistemological classrooms where we're introduced to syllogisms where A is B, B is C, therefore A is C, and although there's some validity to that, often it's more like A is B 40% of the time, A is C 70% of the time, B is M 20% of the time, so how many, at what percentage of time is A equal M? It's much more difficult, and so we need to think about rationality in terms of probabilities more so than syllogisms. The next one is called Art is a Source for Mental Models, and that basically wants to just argue that literature can be a place where we gain lenses through which to see the world. I always like Martha Nussbaum's example of tragedy. from Sophocles in Greek plays, and a tragedy is a trade-off of competing goods. It's not merely a catastrophe. And the arguments he makes is that if in democracy we don't have a category for tragedy, we're going to be disappointed and upset all the time because problems aren't going to be vanishing so much as managed. And so from reading Greek tragedy, we can get a mental model by which to think of the world. And I think other ones could be like irony, tragedy. Well, I mentioned tragedy, paradox, and therefore art can be a source of mental models. Next piece is called Systems Think Before Systematically Thinking. And the way we think about something can be just as important as how hard we think about something. If I try to hammer in a nail with a wrench, it might work, but it might also mess up the job. Nails need hammers, and there are jobs that if I try to use a hammer when a screwdriver is needed, I might break whatever it is I'm working on. So basically, this is just saying we need to do what we're doing now. Think about the frameworks by which we solve problems through. If we use the wrong framework, we're going to have problems. Decide what system is needed or that a problem is situated in before systematically thinking about that problem. And there's a whole conversation on this with Mr. Bartley that you can find to elaborate. The next one is going to be called None of Us is Very Smart, because if you think about it, at most we probably know, 3% of everything that there is to know out there. I mean, how often are we turning to our computers? So none of us are really that smart. And basically the argument is that we need to stop emphasizing being smart and emphasize being logical, which logical is one's reaction to information they are presented with that they don't know the answer ahead of time. So smartness, almost referencing Neil Postman in the paper Trivial, as we discussed, smartness seems almost be a skill at trivia, the ability to know random information, random answers to random questions, where logic is the ability to respond to new information. So I think we need to emphasize being logical more so than being smart, and so on and so forth. The next piece is called Explanations Are Not Evidence. And what this just basically means is, if there's a cup on a table, I could probably come up with 1,000 possible explanations for how it got there, and maybe more. At the end of the day, though, only one explanation would be true. If I convince you that you were obligated to investigate every plausible explanation, then in the name of truth, I would have convinced you to waste a lot of time. So basically, I can always just come up with a story for why things occurred, but that's not in of itself evidence. That's just a framework by which we can then search for evidence. But what's happening, it seems, is now people think that an explanation for X is evidence for X, and that's not the case. And this may also be contributing to the explosion of conspiracy theories, because each one of those is an explanation. And if we think an explanation is in of itself evidence, then we probably won't take the step to examine the conspiracy theory or try to disprove it, because the very fact that the explanation is internally consistent or even presented, we think is evidence of its legitimacy. It's a terrible mistake. Next piece, and there's an O.G. Rose conversation about this too, reality handicaps preventative measures. And basically what this is going to say is that if I exercise and never get sick, I can never know for sure that I wouldn't have gotten sick if I didn't exercise. There's always the possibility that I wasted time. And so there can be an existential nervousness that comes with preventative measures. And this, unfortunately, will have political consequences, especially too, seen as I only have an idea that my preventative measures are stopping something. I can never experience what they stop. And since ideas are not experiences, this can always feel a little unsatisfactory. And so this might be a reason we seem destined to always repeat mistakes and to fall on mistakes, because it is more existentially satisfying to solve a problem because we know we did something, as opposed to prevent a problem from manifesting in the first place. And this is going to be elaborated too in the longer piece, Incentives to Problem Solve. This next piece is called If We're Post-Truth, That Can't Be True, because that's to say we're post-truth would be a truth, and that can't be true if we're post-truth. And so really what's kind of going on is that people are just saying we're post-truth because they don't feel like they have certainty anymore. And really what we are is post-certainty. But certainty was never real in the first place, actually. It was always just confidence. But you see, since we think that if you don't have certainty, you can't have anything, we're becoming epistemic nihilists. But this is a mistake on failing to realize that the loss of certainty doesn't mean you can't have confidence. And this is elaborated on in the paper on certainty, and in the shorter piece, certainty entails a lot of unintended consequences. The next one is called Conclusive Arguments Are Rare, and the question it poses is how many arguments force us to change our views? In other words, how many arguments are out there that aren't merely persuasive but undeniable, And the truth is very few, very little. And also, too, maybe it's undeniable that this coffee cup is here, but I don't even take the time to make arguments to prove the coffee cup is here. If someone takes the time to make an argument, it's going to be about something that's not probably obvious in its facticity, or that the facticity requires interpretation that can be denied. So the thing is, we need to realize that conclusive arguments are very rare, but if we believe we shouldn't believe something unless the argument forces assent, well, then we're never going to believe anything, even like stuff that's like very, very, very likely to be true. And this might contribute also to conspiracy theories and why we're all tribal today, because if we're only going to leave our starting views that we were born with or our political tribes when we encounter a convincing argument, well, that probably will never happen, and so we're never convinced, and democracy can fail. And another reason democracy is in trouble is for this piece 2 called Information Does Not Tell Us What It Means. And basically, information does not tell us what it means. It seems like it does, but it doesn't. We decide the meaning of information, words, and facts, and yet information seems like the meaning is self-evident, that anyone would draw the same conclusions as us if they were trying to really think. If they draw different conclusions, it must mean they're not thinking, that they're ideologically driven, or worse, that they're intentionally misunderstanding the facts. And basically, this is the idea that when we see information, we interpret it into our framework, but we tend to think that we're not interpreting, we're just reading. We think that information tells us what it means in the same way that we think words tell us their definitions, but actually we bring those things to the information and to the words, and by not realizing this can contribute to tribalism, because then we think it's self-evident what it means, and if people disagree, they must be doing it because they're dumb, or maybe just intentionally bigoted or intentionally closed-minded for their own benefit. So it's important to realize that information does not tell us what it means. This next one is called the ubiquity of categorization, and that's going to say that thought pretty much always involves categorizing. Now, there's arguments to be made. We need to learn to be fluid in our categories, kind of like measurement with Whitehead, as Havera talks about, and that's very true. But there is something to say about the role of categorization and inevitability of it. So then we need to be really aware that if we know something is good, or if we know that, say, love is a good category, it's not always self-evident if X falls under that category or not. That's an act of judgment. So we need to recognize that the act of having a category is not the same as judging what should fall under that category, and that's a different act, and we have to realize how to do that. And that's basically the problem of interpretation again. This next one, evaluating evaluation, is going to be saying that if we have all the information in the world, it will be useless to us if we do not have the ability to evaluate it. And David Reef makes this point, where he's pretty much saying that, look, the internet's only useful if you can bring a certain level of expertise to it. You know, you can't tell the difference between a legitimate medical report and a non-legitimate one unless you have some familiarity with medical reports. And so this can be a problem because the internet, we kind of feel like we can evaluate because no one feels like they don't know something, really. I mean, well, not if they really don't know something. I mean, if you know you don't know something, then you know something. So then we get into the whole paper on true ignorance as opposed to ignorance you are aware of. But anyway, we need to realize that lots of information is not very useful unless we have the ability to evaluate it, which is very tricky. And the last one here is going to be called on the problem of saying that's abstract. And basically, we need to be careful with this association of thinking with being abstract like this. We just tend today to think if you are thinking philosophically at all, you're being abstract. And we think of thought as impractical, but then it's a very small step to thinking that thinking is being out of touch, and then you can even start to moralize not thinking. So we need to be careful with saying stuff is abstract. Usually what we mean when we say that's abstract is that we don't understand it, because, you know, you're thinking all the time, how was your day? What did you do at the store? And that doesn't tend to bother us. But it tends to be thought we don't understand. But then the answer is not saying that's abstract and getting rid of it, but actually to think more, to think better. But if for some reason we moralize not thinking because it's quote-unquote abstract, we're going to do the exact opposite of what we need to do to escape that sense of abstraction, which is to garner understanding. But we won't garner it because we will moralize not thinking. So anyway, those are just some short pieces on thinking by O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com. Facebook, YouTube, all like subscriptions are a big help, and thank you so much for your time.